But you know what? As a former prosecutor, I would put a criminal case together without the FBI, without the Justice Department, because they're clearly the most politicized Justice Department in the history of this country. I've got the tape, I've got the proof, I've got the intent. Whether I tie it to the White House or not is for the feds. But as a local prosecutor, when I've got someone coming in, inciting riots, inciting violence, cops bloodied, victims and paid, victims being injured, then I can indict them. Don't wait for the feds, because they ain't coming.
A level, I'll be honest, that is bigger almost than Watergate to me. But the news media is ignoring it.
No, look, this is 100 times bigger than Watergate. Watergate was the stupid action of a handful of people who actually got caught up in the cover-up. Remember, Watergate is one break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters, and then the effort to cover up how it happened. That is a fairly narrow thing. This is a level of corruption that permeates the federal government. This is a level of corruption that you find in the Veterans Administration, you find in the FBI now. I mean, Comey has become a director who is corrupting the system. And you can just tell by looking at, as more and more stuff comes out, you have to say to yourself, how could they possibly not have indicted her? And the reason is simple. The fix was in. You have the Attorney General of the United States in a secret meeting with a former president the week his wife is going to meet with the FBI, and we're supposed to believe that it was purely an accident. This is a level of fundamental dishonesty across the whole system.
And by the way, it's not just Republicans. There are some Democrats who are scared too. We need to have leadership on this. It is not, we cannot turn these people away.
And I think the Syrian people know that Hillary's the answer for them too. You know, I think they know.
The alternative, we're going to be an isolationist country and turning everybody away. It is not okay.
That kind of talk is music to the ears of the Syrian men we met in Athens, Greece recently.
You guys must really hate Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, no, we don't hate Hillary Clinton. We like
you like her?
Yes.
There's going to be continued pressure for a criminal investigation of what we know went on, no matter who's elected president. And so I wouldn't necessarily count out a criminal investigation of Mrs. Clinton even under a Clinton administration, because I don't think the Attorney General that Mrs. Clinton would appoint would have much in the way of an argument to stop a special counsel from being appointed. How can that person investigate Mrs. Clinton without obviously a conflict of interest being so apparent? And Judicial Watch quickly took the lead in uncovering basically everything we know to date about the Clinton email scandal. And you'll see how we even led the FBI in terms of investigating it. And it was in one of those cases that led to discovery, which is evidence gathering. We took testimony of Cheryl Mills, Mrs. Clinton's former chief of staff at the State Department, Yuma Abedin, a deputy chief of staff, and many, many Clinton officials at the State Department who knew or should have known about the Clinton email scandal. And in fact, in one of our cases, Mrs. Clinton had to submit a statement under penalty of perjury that was produced to the court, saying that as far as she knew, all the Clinton emails that she had were turned over to the government that were government related. Well, in fact, we now know that 30,000 emails were deleted, and many of those were actually government related emails that shouldn't have been deleted. And as a result of all of this litigation, the FBI was pressured and the Justice Department was pressured to undergo, at least to begin, at least the appearance of a criminal investigation into Mrs. Clinton's handling of the emails. And as we've learned over the last several weeks, obviously the FBI decided not to prosecute or recommend a prosecution, and the the Obama Justice Department decided not to prosecute her based on the alleged recommendation of Mr. Comey, the FBI director. But as we find out more details about the FBI investigation, we found out that a lot of these investigations that the FBI was undertaking didn't take place but for Judicial Watch's pressure from the litigation. The witnesses weren't questioned until it became clear Judicial Watch was either going to get discovery or was getting discovery and would be questioning some of these same witnesses. It was so bad that we just learned in the latest FBI document dump that the FBI was using documents produced to Judicial Watch under the Freedom of Information Act with redactions. So they couldn't even get the full document, and they were using those documents to question the witnesses. And of course, there's a lot of outrage about the FBI immunity agreements or Department of Justice immunity agreements granted the Clinton aides at issue in this case, and we'll get into that later. But I also want to call attention to the fact that Congress has been making a lot of noise. The FBI director was testifying earlier this week to Congress. But let's highlight the fact that Congress can take steps that it's refusing to take to hold Mrs. Clinton accountable on this email scandal. And I think this is something important to remember. You know, Mrs. Clinton testified to Congress that she turned over all of her government emails. We know that to be false. And Congress, what did it do? It referred that question of whether she committed perjury to the Department of Justice for a criminal investigation. Well, who are they fooling? They know what's going to happen at the Obama Justice Department. They already know where the FBI director comes down on that. Why isn't there a contempt citation pending against Mrs. Clinton now? Why do they have to wait for the Justice Department to do something? If they think that she was in contempt of Congress, the way they treated in terms of her testimony being incorrect or false, and the fact that emails were destroyed after Congress subpoenaed them, why is it that Congress isn't holding Mrs. Clinton in contempt? The answer is somewhat obvious. They have an election, and they don't want accountability in a true sense of the word to get in the way of their quest for retaining Congress. And I'm talking about the Republican leadership. And the other uncomfortable point I'm going to bring up, at least from the point of view, I think, of many Republican leaders, is that they can also impeach Mrs. Clinton. And they don't have to wait for her to be president to impeach her. Congress retains the ability to impeach a federal officer for conduct, whether that officer was whether that officer is still in office or not. Probably, other than one of the few folks in the country who's read all the Clinton emails that have been released and knows what others are about to be released and can give us a great update and certainly some unique insight on the classification issues that have been we've been so misled about, thanks to John Kerry's State Department, the Obama administration, and Mr. Comey.
Thank you, Tom, and it's great to be with this panel. What a great opportunity for the American public to get up to speed on what the real story is, and not necessarily the talking points from the Clinton campaign or from the Justice Department. You know, I come at this investigation, at this whole problem of Clinton corruption, from the perspective of an intelligence officer. I was commissioned as an Army intelligence officer, became a special agent of Army counterintelligence, and then later on was trained as a clandestine human intelligence case officer. So my view on these things is both from a defensive standpoint, from counterintelligence perspective, having conducted counterespionage investigations, but also from the point of view of an intelligence officer looking to collect against a target. And so when you look at the track record, at the pattern of behavior, of the conduct, of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed through this entire scandal, you know, the American public is being misled, and they're being misled in a very deliberate fashion, which is not just disturbing from a factual basis, but it's deeply corrosive to the public's understanding of what's been put at risk by Mrs. Clinton and her conduct. So as a special agent of Army counterintelligence, I'm directly personally responsible for neutralizing, for stopping 6 Foreign Intelligence Service agents. Those are cases that I ran. I've put people in jail, not just under the American legal system, but even under the German legal system. I've worked with the Attorney General in Baden-Württemberg to put a guy in jail for spying, for espionage. And in particular, I think everyone needs to appreciate that Mrs. Clinton was the subject of a national security crime investigation. This wasn't a security review. It wasn't an argument over classification levels. This was a violation of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 793F, mishandling national defense information. And contrary to what the American public has been told repeatedly, intent is not an element of the crime. There's no requirement to prove any sort of intent at all. And so when Mr. Comey talks about intent, or he wasn't able to prove it, or there was no sort of specification that showed an intent, it's a red herring. It's a false argument. It isn't a requirement of the crime. So we know from the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community that 22 top secret SCI, which is sensitive compartmented information, it's a special category of intelligence collection, 22 top secret SCI messages or emails went across Mrs. Clinton's unsecured server. It's a fact. It's a finding of the Inspector General. That's the root of the referral to the Department of Justice that caused them to begin this inquiry. The fact that that has occurred puts the United States at grave risk That's the definition, really, for compromising top secret material. That is the issue that is really the focal point of what the FBI should have been looking at. And it's a yes or no question. It's not what did you intend. It's not how did you feel about it. It's not what were you really trying to accomplish. It's a yes or no question. Did this event occur? Yes or no? And then if it did occur, who is responsible for it? What is the proximate cause of this event occurring? And if you walk it back to find the person who made it happen, that's who's prosecuted. And this whole intent thing is nonsense. Mr. Comey is lying to the American public when he goes down that path. Look, on this investigation itself, there's a methodology that any counterintelligence professional goes through when it comes to collecting evidence, interviewing people who are either witnesses or subjects. Anybody who has access to sensitive compartmental information is subject to a polygraph. Have you ever heard anybody discuss Mrs. Clinton being polygraphed? Not a whisper, not a word. And I can assure you that there are hundreds of thousands of persons in this country with security clearances, whether it's law enforcement, the intelligence services, the armed forces, who are all routinely subject to polygraph exams. I myself have been polygraphed several times. And because I had access, not just to SCI material, but also to something Mrs. Clinton was familiar with, and that's a SAP, a Special Access Program. And so that wasn't even brought up as a question or an issue. Why wasn't she questioned about being polygraphed? It's a requirement. I think the most telling thing with respect to Mrs. Clinton in this national security crime investigation is that this sort of brokered voluntary interview that seems to have been orchestrated by David Kendall was not a rights warning environment. It wasn't a rights warning event. That was my first question when I learned that she was being questioned that Saturday morning. Because if I'm a federal law enforcement officer and I have reason to believe you've committed a crime and I'm questioning you concerning that, I'm obligated to give you a Miranda warning. I have to give you a rights warning. It's not negotiable. And so if I'm not Mirandizing you, if I'm not giving you a rights warning, and I'm a law enforcement officer who's capable of apprehending you for a violation of the law, and I don't do a rights warning, don't take it too terribly serious, even if you do bring 9 attorneys to the interview with you. That's a very telling moment that it wasn't a rights warning. The larger scale thing, I think also, sort of the unintended consequence of all this, my last point I'll wrap on, is that the FBI director, Mr. Comey, is personally compromised. He's complicit in this scandal. And there's a larger, besides that very unfortunate, very sad circumstance, the larger thing is the institutional damage done to the FBI.
American people today.
Well, I want to focus on the scandal within the scandal. And by that I mean what James Comey has done to the FBI. This is a sad and terrible moment in American history of law enforcement. Never before has there been such a public and sad display of poor judgment, and I must say, political influence in a decision as to whether or not to recommend charges. I do not believe at this point that the Director Comey is fit to continue in office. I believe that a resolution of no confidence in him should be filed in the Senate. I believe that his recent testimonies on Capitol Hill are rife with the type of arrogance and obfuscation that should disqualify anyone with the kind of power that the FBI director has from continuing in office. I believe that he has violated his oath as the director of the FBI because after looking at the entire record that he has made public, and it is not the entire record, it is very clear that from the moment he took control of this investigation, he decided that he was not going to recommend the prosecution of the first female nominee of a major party for President of the United States. The FBI director made a political decision. He did not make a law enforcement decision. And every step that he took in conducting this investigation, quote unquote, which it was not, shows you categorically that it was not a legitimate investigation. And I say that with sadness. You recounted the number of federal offices that I've held that involve investigation. I consider, James Comey said that no reasonable prosecutor would bring the case that they had come up with based on the facts. That is utter nonsense. His news conference, and it wasn't a news conference because he didn't answer any questions, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and call it his news, where he explained not all, but most of the details of her transgressions, and then concluded, to the amazement of most of the FBI agents in that building and almost all of the former FBI agents in the United States, that there was no crime because there was no intent, was absolutely ludicrous. Not only was his news conference sophomoric in its content and in its delivery, but he followed it up later on September the 7th with an email to his staff after he took tremendous criticism for his explanation. I'm going to read a couple of sentences from that memo to the FBI staff, and I will assure you it is not a memo that J. Edgar Hoover or any other former FBI director would have written. It is embarrassment piled upon embarrassment. It has a Valley Boy quality to it that is so sad to hear an FBI director talk this way. Now, it is evident to me that what Mr. Comey should have done at the beginning of this investigation was impanel a grand jury. He did not do that. When you want to investigate crimes involving national security information, classified information, you don't do interviews. You issue subpoenas to witnesses, third parties for documents. You make people come into court and fight them in front of a federal judge, and you worry about attorney-client privilege and all that, and you work that out. Director Comey didn't do that. Now, why did he not do that? He didn't do it because he didn't want to investigate it. He wanted to conclude this investigation before the election. And the only thing he could do to conclude it was to find that she did not commit a crime, Mrs. Clinton. That conclusion, again, by anyone who's looked at this evidence, who's a reasonable prosecutor, is absolutely ludicrous. There were multiple crimes here committed by her. There were certainly crimes committed by lawyers involved in the case, by employees of the Clinton apparatus, the destruction of evidence, the manner in which witnesses were handled. One lawyer representing 3 or 4 witnesses. The Justice Department never permits that, but Comey and the Attorney General allowed it. Deletion of emails after they were subpoenaed by Congress. Destruction of evidence by lawyers, which Mr. Comey says he found no criminal intent in that. I must say, after watching Director Comey testify and give his news conference, one has the sense of a Russian village. This is like a Potemkin village. This was a fake investigation. Everybody knows it. I flew to Los Angeles at the beginning of this week with a former head of counterintelligence for the FBI. And we chatted throughout the flight about this. And he bemoaned the performance of the FBI director. And he said the thing that hurt the most was how embarrassed the employees were. That's why he sent out this silly memo on September the 7th, where he literally almost laughs at them for being concerned and asks them not to do that. I think what also is very, very serious about this from a public policy standpoint and from good government standpoint, he created a double standard of justice at the highest levels of government. There are now two systems of justice for people with classified information clearances. The big shots get a pass, the little people go to prison. It is as simple as that. It is tawdry, it is disgusting, it is flagrantly violative of his oath. And when you destroy the concept of the fair administration of justice, you know what the American people do? They get worried. They lose confidence. And the worst thing for this country is for the American people not to trust the FBI. And they don't right now. And there's a reason for it. It's because James Comey heads the FBI. He should be gone. Now, he's not going to go. He's not going to resign. Congress is not going to impeach him. But what they should do, what Congress should do, is they should pass a resolution of no confidence. They should tell him that his news conference, his memo to his employees, his conclusion, his so-called investigation are not the kind of things that they expect from a real FBI director. I must tell you that I think that his performance is almost as brazen in its cleverness as Hillary Clinton's brazenness in her destruction of the emails. It is fascinating that the two of them seem to be traveling in a parallel way together, hand in hand through the meadow. If you sit back and talk to FBI agents around the country about this investigation and the way he has explained it and described it, I've heard people call him, the FBI agents in the big building in Washington call him the Cardinal. One of them said to me the other day that Mr. Comey heard that there was a vacancy in the Holy Trinity and he's applied. He has a sense of himself that is so pompous and arrogant, and you see it. You know, he's a man of great height, and I mean, he's a very impressive fellow, and he knows it. And he uses it as a tool, and he uses it in Congress. His pretense yesterday and at the other hearings that he was deeply offended that anyone would question the integrity of his investigation. You'd have to be a loon not to question the integrity of his investigation. It's so blatantly obvious that this was like a cheap prize fight, and he took a dive. I mean, this is the 1930s movie, you know, where a bunch of hoods pay some guys off and a guy takes a dive. That's what this was. This was a law enforcement dive. And for him to sit there and pretend to members of Congress that he was offended by having the conduct of him and his agency called weaselly is quite sad. I think everyone knows what he did. He took a pass, he took a dive, and I think what he has done to the agency is what matters to me. I don't care about James Comey. I mean, he will go. His term, he has 6 more years or whatever, and good riddance to him when it's over. But the truth is this. He has done damage that is incalculable and irreparable at this point to the FBI, because now what will people think of the next classified information case when there was no grand jury in this case, not a single subpoena was issued, and he grants immunity to a number of people who never should have been granted immunity. They should have been thrown in front of a grand jury, forced to take the fifth, and then continue the investigation. The absence of a grand jury is the answer to every one of his questions of his critics. He says, well, what did you expect me to do? Well, Mr. Director, we expected regular order. We call that regular order. When you have a serious criminal violation, and there is no doubt that when Mrs. Clinton, he says there was no intent, and you're absolutely right, Chris. Intent was not required under this statute. It's gross negligence. However, there are other parts of that statute that require intent that could have been met by a legitimate investigation. And if the director of the FBI thinks that putting a private server in a private home in Chappaqua, New York, with no encryption, with multiple devices working off it with they're not encrypted, is not a violation of 793, that's another reason he should resign. Yep. It is, to me, this is one of the grossest miscarriages of justice. All of these people sitting around in the military who have lost their clearances, lost their jobs, been prosecuted. That poor submarine guy who took a photograph which he never sent to his family, the guy was prosecuted and was convicted and has a year in the brig. How can Comey go to sleep at night knowing about that kid? I must say, I find Comey's presence still in the directorship at the FBI an insult to everybody in federal law enforcement. And I think he should go, and I think he's violated his oath, and I think that Congress should at least do something to manifest their outrage at this clearly political decision he made. And, you know, I think the fact that he's offended shows that he knows how awful his performance was as a federal law enforcement official. And all you have to do is talk to people like James Kallstrom in New York, the great assistant director, who called this a farce, because that's what it is. This investigation was a farce, and Comey knows it.